Good morning, everyone. I'm actually here not to plug anything except ancient Indian wisdom. And actually, let me start off by saying that even that, I'm not one of these guys who thinks, wow, everything about the past was glorious. There was this historian, Gibbon, who said of the Holy Roman Empire that it was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. And to some extent, one could say that about ancient Indian wisdom. Much of it is not ancient, a lot of it is not Indian, and a great deal of it is not wisdom. But there is a great deal of wisdom still when you take out that which is not wise. And that's what I would like to talk about. And in the past 25 years, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at one aspect of it, and that's the Vedanta, the Upanishads. And so I sort of fell in love with the Upanishads in the 90s when I was trying to finish my dissertation at UCLA. And over 25 years, I've sort of tried to see how it applies to business. And what I'll be talking about is that aspect of it. And again, I want to remind you that I see ancient Indian wisdom as something where there's a core to be preserved, but a lot needs to be renewed. And keeping that in mind, let me just, unfortunately, I do have some slides to show you because there's a lot to cover. And let me see if I can, I'm going to just move this. Give me a few seconds. Sorry for this. Okay. Can everyone hear me clearly? Okay. So I'm just going to, so the starting point in all this, as we discuss this conclave, and this is my assumption, the starting point is we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that is, we will continue to explore models of capitalism. The debate about capitalism versus socialism versus Marxism versus communism, in my mind, is dead. That unfortunately or fortunately, there is a model that has prevailed, and that's the model of capitalism, but it has many flaws in it. So to me, the core assumption I'm making is, how can we improve upon capitalism without throwing the core elements of it? And a key core element of capitalism, perhaps the central element of capitalism, is the private ownership of property and the means of production. So assuming that private ownership continues in whatever model we're developing, how could we improve upon those other aspects of capitalism that have created a lot of trouble for us? So that's my core assumption here. That's the starting point. And just to begin with the definition, capitalism is all about an economic system where the means of wealth generation, distribution, and creation are privately owned, either individuals or organizations, just to get the definition out of the way. And if you look at that, here are a couple of approaches to capitalism that have been tried with varying degrees of success. First and foremost is free market capitalism, and this is the model that developed in the West. Actually, in the 18th century, it's not very recent. The notion of capital has been around for centuries, but the notion of capitalism, the ISM at the end of capital, is really in the 18th century, and subsequently Marxism in the 19th century and so on. So it's really only 200 years old. And free market capitalism, the key notion in free market capitalism is the means through which this wealth is generated is through markets, predominantly through markets. And typically markets consisting of individual actors, and the core assumption made by economists is these actors are rational. They maximize rational expectations, they maximize their utility. So that's the core assumption. And there's another core assumption, self-interest drives this rational expectations model. So these are the two core assumptions, rational in terms of maximizing the utility, and self-interest as a core of it. So I sort of see these models in terms of means, ways, and ends. So the end in capitalism, in the free market model, is GDP at the macro level, gross development product. And GDP has come in for a lot of criticism. I won't go into the details here, but it's a big driver of growth. And if you're a company, and in the capitalist system, revenues is your big driver. And then also per capita GDP, per capita income, and so on, and net income if you're a corporate. So these are some key ends that you have in mind. If you're a CEO, if you're a senior executive, these are the things you care about. There's one other assumption to free market capitalism that's very important that we need to keep in mind, and that's the notion of compound growth. Many have said, in fact, I think Einstein said that's the eighth wonder of the world. The notion of compounded growth is the eighth wonder of the world. And it's a key assumption in free market capitalism that we will keep growing. Year upon year, we'll keep growing. And there have been many criticisms of that approach. In fact, there's an estimate, one of these investors who invests in sustainable products, Jeremy Grantham of the Grantham Institute, draws this analogy. If we keep that up, this notion of compound growth at the rate of 4%, even let's say 4% per year, is the equivalent to the Egyptian pharaohs taking let's say 1 meter of space, and let's say in the 3,000 years that the Egyptian civilization has lasted, if that gets compounded, if you think of the total space that would be taken up, it would be beyond the known galaxy, as big as the known beyond the galaxy. So that's the kind of growth we're talking about, year upon year, over hundreds of years, and that's simply not possible. So that's the key problem with the free market capitalism approach. The ways for it, the ways in which you achieve this compounded growth, the ways in which you achieve constantly growing GDP, is through the notion of efficient markets, what I just described earlier. The markets are efficient. And then rational actors, and as I said, utility maximization. The means for it, and means are those resources you draw upon to create the ways which in turn lead to the ends, are financial capital, technology capital, material capital, and self-interest. Self-interest is sort of the internal means, and these are the other kinds of capital. And more in the last 20 years, financial capital has come to dominate the conversation and the growth of capitalism. So much so that it's become rent-seeking, in the sense that it doesn't create value, but reallocates value, typically to the top 1%. And this is the reason why we have all this criticism in India and the US and the West about how free market capitalism has led to the 1% getting richer and richer. Because, in a sense, financial capital has steered the wealth that way. So that's free market capitalism. They're mostly practiced in the West, and the Norwegian and the Scandinavian models are variations around it. Then comes state capitalism. This is the other model, the Beijing consensus, as it's called, or the Chinese model. Here you still have a market, but the key players in the market are state-owned enterprises. It's astonishing how much of China's economy is controlled by state-owned enterprises. Even though you have private billionaires, many, many billionaires, nevertheless, power is in the hands of state-owned enterprises. And so the ends continue to be GDP and per capita income and net income and growth, but there's a different element that comes in as one of the ends, and that's political control. State-owned, therefore political control, to maintain a system of communism in place, the single-party rule. The ways for it are state-controlled markets, state-owned enterprises, but this requires frequent state intervention. To maintain this control, you need frequent state intervention. Unlike in the free market, ideally you have much less state intervention. And then the means that drive the ways that drive the ends are certainly financial capital, technology, and material capital, especially as China begins to invest in its infrastructure. Material capital takes over, and political capital. This notion of political capital is being used in this. So these are the two main models that India at some level has tried to follow in varying degrees. And if you now think in terms of what is the future growth model for India, and if you're thinking in terms of what's an all-round growth model that is not skewed one way or the other, not skewed to the 1%, not skewed to certain castes, not skewed to certain divisions and groups. So that's, in a sense, the core issue we're discussing here. How could we create a balanced, equitable, all-round growth model? So this is a framework that helps us think, helps me at least, think through this. So on the x-axis is the drive towards greater democracy. State control, which is who's the key decision maker in this system of capitalism, a move from state to the individual. As you can see, China is on the state side, the West is on the individual side. But there's another very important dimension, and this is a dimension that's come through, especially in sustainability research, and that's the notion of moving beyond self-interest, which as we saw is a key driver of free market capitalism, towards shared interest. Where it's self plus others. The others could be other human beings, could be rest of society, could be nature especially. So my own background has been really on the environment for the past decade. So, and that's a move, one could say, towards greater consciousness, expanding your sense of self, your greater consciousness. So that's the other dimension. So if you plot on those dimensions, you see China on the left-hand side. More state control, trying to become shared interest oriented in terms of going beyond the individual. And then you see the West, free market, on the right-hand side, individual and self-interest as the driver. Unfortunately, these two models of capitalism, while their ideal or targeted location is where it's indicated, there's a shadow side to them. They devolve into a worse form of capitalism. So the free market capitalism becomes more controlled by a few players. May not necessarily be the state, but groups, billionaires and so on, controlling that capitalism. And Chinese models, again, come down to self-interest. And self-interest are the few people who control it. And, for example, after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, there was the gang of 8 immortals. the 8 immortals, who were people who participated in those reforms and drove them, their children now control a lot of China. So it's the sense of, even though you aspire to state control, it becomes controlled by a few individuals. And that's where the shadow side of both models are. And at some level, one could argue India is somewhere there. It's not capitalism in its true sense. It's, it's got elements of both. So the question is, and this is the key question I've been trying to work on for a few years, how could India go to the top right-hand side, continue with that focus on individuals, but ensure there's shared interest? So that's essentially the question that I'm asking here, and hopefully the conclave will ask. Greater shared interest, but continue to maintain the democratic underpinnings of our system. And for that, this is why I've become interested in ancient Indian wisdom, because of the externalities of those two models. Let me quickly summarize. These are things we all know. The models we've examined, the Chinese model, the Western model, there's been a lack of harmony or balance between the different kinds of capital. If you think of nature as natural capital, and if you think of society as social capital, and then of course we have financial, material, and other kinds of capital, there's been a lack of balance. And the balance has reflected itself in two ways. Social inequality, in particular income inequality. The Gini coefficient is the measure of that. Even in the US, which people think is relatively balanced or equal, the Gini coefficient has increased from 0.38 close to 0.5. And for those who don't know the Gini coefficient, if Gini coefficient is 1, that means all wealth is in one individual. If Gini coefficient is 0, it means all wealth is equally distributed. So as you approach 0.5, as is happening in the US, you're becoming more and more like African tin pot dictatorships in a way. And that's what's happening in the US. Coefficients are moving up towards the 1. And then if you look at the environment side, there's tremendous research that shows that among all these limits to our growth, to what the Earth can bear, we've actually crossed 3 of them. Climate change, biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle. We are close to crossing barriers in terms of phosphorus, in terms of land use, and so on. And water especially. Water is the other big limit that we are crossing. So clearly, the two models have not worked. They have had these externalities, as they're called, that have just not worked. So the question then is, we're aspiring to get to that level of shared interest, but retain the importance of the individual. What could ancient Indian wisdom tell us about it? And to me, this is what is fascinating about ancient wisdom. And so therefore, I'm proposing a new model of capitalism called dharma capitalism. Dharma has many different meanings, and those who've read Gusharan Das's book recognize that it has subtle meanings, many different. But one key meaning that I'm going to take about dharma is its original meaning, and that is balance. There is a universal harmony of balance, and that's the notion of balance that I'll see as the key element of dharma capitalism. And if you take that, there's a very interesting story, which unfortunately I have to give you very quickly. I don't have enough time for it. It's a story from the Upanishads, from the Chandogya Upanishad. And some of you may have heard this. This is the story of Indra and Virochana hearing about Prajapati, the Lord of beings, as knowing what the meaning of the self is. And they approach Prajapati and say, please tell us what the self means. What is this secret knowledge that you have of the self? And Prajapati makes them be a disciple for many years, and then says, after many, many years, he says to them, the self is what you put on. Put on these attractive clothes, polish your nails, comb your hair, look in a mirror or look in water. What you see is the self. Virochana, the king of the anti-gods of the demons, takes this message to heart, goes back and says, that's what the self is, the physical self. The one that separates me from you, from Benedict and others, is that physical self is the self. But Indra, king of the gods, as he's coming back, he realizes there's a problem with this. He goes back to Prajapati and says, this wisdom doesn't make sense. Because the body dies, the body is not separate from another body. This is not permanent wisdom. And through a series of different explanations, Prajapati then conveys the importance of shared interest, that we are connected. And in some ways, the word Upanishad itself means hidden connections. We think of Upanishads as sitting nearby a master. But really, the core meaning of Upanishads is hidden connections. And that's what Prajapati says, and that's, in my mind, the core of what we need to do. Balance can be restored between these different forms of capital and between these different classes and castes and groups if we can understand the hidden connections and we develop those hidden connections. That's why if you look at dharma capitalism, the ends would be well-being as opposed to just GDP, would be the creation of a beingful society being translates to Atman Brahman, and balance among capitals would be a core end of that framework. The ways would be predominantly free market, being-full businesses, and my book is about being-full businesses, also called being-centered businesses, well-being maximization as opposed to profit maximization. And then the means itself will be all kinds of capital, and this important emphasis on self plus others' interest. It can be done. Gandhi showed it, many companies have showed it. The many, many companies I've studied have got their employees to think in terms of shared interest. Dr. V is a great example of the notion of shared interest. But there's another concept that is important, and I call it being capital. So let me spend some time on being capital. The Sanskrit word for it is Atma Shakti. And so the reason why I emphasize this is many models of change address only the first or the second levels of change. All my research shows that those two levels of change are completely insufficient. I've tried to work with many companies trying to change them to become more sustainable. So the first level of change is all about direct causes and effects, what you can measure. You know, what you measure, you can manage. Unfortunately, it turns out that that's not a powerful motivator of change. And so then the next level would be these externalities, measuring the cost of natural capital and so on. So much of my research suggests, yes, that's helpful, but it's still not enough. What I've found to be a key driver, perhaps a necessary driver, and perhaps even a sufficient driver of change, is your internal sense of self, your mindset. It's at that level, mindsets and sense of self, that true change can happen. And that's what's missing in many models of growth. Missing in not just economic models, but other models of growth. And that's where I think being capital, the sense of self that you have, these drivers of what you have, can really play a role. And that I see as the key driver of Dharma capitalism. And what is being capital? This is a new kind of capital. It's really what we've known for a long time, but we've not pulled together under the notion of capital. It is that stock of inner resources for a person or a group that really energizes the right balance between the different forms of capital. We know when forests are getting destroyed in order to create apartments and buildings, there's something in us that says this is out of balance. We know when rivers are getting polluted in order to feed a factory, that there's something out of balance. It's that same sense that our ancestors had, which they encapsulated in this notion of dharma. And that's what being capital is. The sense within us, that internal sense, and in my mind, I view it as coming from not the small self, but the higher self, that tells us that something is out of balance. And we instinctively know what balance is. That's what I mean as being capital. When we connect with this higher self, we sort of know what the balance is. And that's what I see being capital as a big driver. There are many elements of being capital, integrity, long-term thinking, care, and so on. That can be done. These are concepts that we all are aware of. Last slide. And I'm getting signals to wrap this up. The question then is, how do you enable being capital? So I've sort of gone through the different forms of capitalism. I've proposed an alternative called dharma capitalism. I've sort of gone back to ancient wisdom, told you a story. The question I always get is, how do you do this? This seems very idealistic. How do you do this? Clearly, I can't answer that question in this 2 minutes remaining, but it has been done. To me, it goes back to a key verse in the Mundaka Upanishad. The Mundaka Upanishad talks of two selves. Dvao suparnao saija sakhayam samanam vraksham parishasvajate tayoranyah pipulam swadyatya anashnamanyora bichaksiti. What that means is there are two selves in us. We always think of the lower self, but we are not just the lower self. Our systems of education, our systems of practice, our companies need to emphasize that higher sharing self. If you emphasize the self-interested self, you get self-interested idiots. If you emphasize the sharing self, you get sharing wise people. So it's a question of what you emphasize. And that's really what, so the methodology in this book describes a 4-step approach: recognition, recognizing the higher self, experiencing the higher self, anchoring in the higher self, and leading by example. So these are practices that need to be brought in my mind, at business schools, at schools, in corporations, wherever business is practiced. When that happens, my faith, I guess my sense is, we'll begin to develop being capital in us, which would lead to beingful ways, which in turn leads to dharma capitalism, which in turn leads to this balance between different forms of capital. Thank you.